Let's have a chat now about funding models. There's no question whatsoever that right now we are at a moment of inflection. Blockchain maybe meets Basquiat, or impact bonds which are funding folk festivals, and pension funds which are grappling with culture, not just because it's overhead, but that it actually exists in our very infrastructure. But the real question is, how do you put a price tag on identity? How do you scale authenticity? How do you make sure that it still feels and is authentic, but the scale is so much larger? Well, that's what we're going to be exploring in the next 30 minutes. It'll be myself and my panel, so I'm going to ask you to give a very, very warm welcome to the following gentlemen. First off, Majid bin Abdul Muhsin Al Hugail, the CEO of the Cultural Development Fund. Jonas Höglin, the CEO and co-founder of Art Collectum, and Salman Mahdi, the Global Vice Chairman of Deutsche Bank Private Bank. Gentlemen, to all three of you, a very good afternoon. Please have a seat, have a seat, have a seat.
Thank you.
Welcome, welcome.
Thank you.
This is great because I love having conversations where we get to stretch ourselves a little bit and push our thinking a little bit. I'm not the banker, I'm not the financier, so please be gentle with me, okay? I don't know if I'm going to be gentle with you, but please be gentle with me. All right. There is always the question about when we appreciate and consider this moment of inflection that we're at, where we know the impact that culture has on people's well-being, but also know increasingly on GDPs and productivity. We have to think better about how do we scale that. But the question is not so easy because the funding models that exist are very structured and they were developed for very particular means, not necessarily for cultural initiatives, for artwork, or artwork maybe, but not necessarily for those. So perhaps if I can begin with you. We need structured finance when it comes to cultural initiatives. But that word structure is very key when it comes to finance. So how should culture go about providing the requisite assurance that structured finance needs in order to let go of its capital?
Thank you, Tommy, and very pleased to be here. I believe investors look for four things: strong economic angle, standardized parameters, predictable cash flow, and visible exit. We at CDF, our investment strategy is designed to deliver all four. So the first element is the strong economic angle. So globally, the contribution to creativity and culture industry worth around $2.3 trillion annually, equivalent to 3.1% of the global GDP, supporting over 30 million jobs. In Saudi Arabia, we are aligning with this reality, and the cultural contribution to the local economy is more than $10 billion, and the contribution to the GDP was less than 1% in 2018, grew to 1.5 in 2023, and expected to exceed 3% by 2030. The second element is the standardized parameters. So in Saudi Arabia, the cultural sector is managed and regulated by the Ministry of Culture and 11 cultural commissions. Each commission is responsible and looking for a specific sector, from fashion, film, music, all the way to visual arts and performing arts. At CDF, we build on this structure by setting clear investment parameters to support the 11 cultural sectors. The third element is the predictable cash flow. So the FDI inflow to creativity and culture was actually jumped from $20 million in 2022 to around $267 million in 2023. the funding demand is expected to exceed $20 billion by 2030. And we believe it's a great opportunity to the international investors to come in and step in and translate this funding demand into revenue opportunities. The fourth element is the viable exit or the visible exit. So Saudi Arabia is becoming a very attractive market to the cultural investors. And today, the kingdom dominates the MENA IPO landscape in the region. So 42 IPOs were successfully completed in Saudi Arabia out of 52 last year, which is more than 75%. This is complemented with the continuous reforms of the public markets and improving liquidity and attracting international investment to be part of it. So for investors, confidence comes from de-risking. We believe that the culture in Saudi Arabia is becoming a stable and credible asset class, giving the strong demand, clear rules, and exit visibility.
So when I'm listening to you and I'm hearing this need for trying to create some kind of vehicle in which the cultural aspect is going to exist in funding, what are the modifications that one has to consider? And the reason I ask is because by its very nature, a creative industry needs that sort of free-flowing, less rigid environment. What do you think the modifications then need to be to try to assist you in delivering what you're trying to do?
Well, the culture and creative enterprises often face high risk, making it harder for commercial lenders to underwrite loans. The funding demand is expected, actually has been doubled, I would say, in the last 3 years, reaching $6 billion and expected to reach $20 billion by 2030 and having a funding gap of $8 billion. I believe development funds should work very closely with investors, commercial banks, to unlock liquidity. This can happen through coverage funding of the high-risk cultural subsectors, sharing risks, and also de-risking, I would say, specific cultural transactions together.
Salman, I know you've been nodding for the past 2 minutes. I'm going to come to you. If you can just hang on for a little bit longer, I want to come to you, Jonas, first. So one of the questions that I can imagine, not necessarily living in the creatives industry world full-time, is the question of standardization, right? And standardization when it comes to making sure that we have uniformity in terms of how we try to value an asset. So let's talk about valuation then.
Yes.
If we know that we have all these numbers, we have a lot of value, 2.9 trillion upwards of cultural investment coming from the industry into global GDP, etc. So the numbers are significant. But that doesn't change the fact that we need to still value in order to extract increased capital. And so if, for example, we were looking at a discounted cash flow mechanism, which is a very structured, formal way of saying this is the value of this asset now, in 20 years' time, we anticipate it is going to have this valuation. We cannot do that necessarily with art or with cultural activities and initiatives, generally speaking. How do you think, then, we need to be thinking about valuing these assets? Because they are assets.
So, first of all, I would like to express my gratitude to His Highness Prince Badr bin Abdullah bin Farhan Al Saud for the invitation to be a featured speaker at the conference. It is a great honor. And to give a good answer to the questions about valuations, I would like to just give a short background about Arte Collectum and how the idea came about. An old friend of mine, Niklas Belenius, who is a gallery owner and a third-generation art collector and art dealer, asked me about 6 years ago if I wanted to set up an art fund together with him. I have been working in finance since 2006 and previously always wondered why internationally well-established art that has low correlation with other asset classes and that had good historical returns and therefore can create a more well-diversified portfolio hadn't been offered as an alternative investment in Northern Europe before. So I told Niklas that I would be happy to set up the fund, but with a couple of prerequisites. The first being that we wanted to make sure that we would get an approved prospectus by the Swedish Financial Supervisory Authority and also list the fund on an exchange so that we would get as much transparency in the investment as possible. Within Arte Collectum, we have our own compliance committee with the main task to follow a regulatory framework, audit authenticity, and monitor conflicts of interest. We have completed due diligence processes with 2 banks, Nordea and SEB, both of which have approved the fund and that are distributing the fund as we speak. The first due diligence process was with Nordea back in 2022. It was a 3-month project that eventually got approved, and then the second one was with SEB, which was more extensive and took 5 months to complete. And these banks used more than 10 people each to conclude these due diligence processes that have been very instructive and is a proof of that Arte Collectum has a very solid fund structure. When it comes to valuation, we have a valuation part in Sotheby's. They do value the art on a semi-annual basis, where they value each individual artwork in the funds. And they send us a valuation report on the 30th of June and the 31st of December of each year, which we use for calculating the net asset value in the funds. And we do publish these net asset values in the financial statements in the end of February and in the interim reports in the end of August of each year. And these valuations are quite tricky to make because they are basically estimates, especially in a very early stage of the fund. Because what we are talking about is unique artworks, which are unique to its nature in the way that you only know the value when you actually sell the work. The investment committee has sold 1 work so far, and we made the divestment with 2.57 times the invested amount within 18 months. And the valuation of that artwork was valued at price just a few months earlier. So that will give you an idea of how it works. And when it comes to fund structure and structuring the asset, when we do acquire works, we have been making 60 acquisitions to date. We have a very structured process in making sure that these transactions go through in a solid way. We start off with a phase 1 protocol that the investment committee has to send to the compliance committee to get the approval to continue acquiring potential work. If they get the approval, it moves over to a KYC process where we send a Know Your Client information request to the seller, where we want to find out what the identity of the people behind the business is, the identity of the business being a certificate of company registration that cannot be older than 7 days, and we are also looking for the ownership and control structure and beneficial owners and certified passport copies, as well as politically exposed persons and sanction checks. When that has been completed, we send it to the seller to have it signed. When it has been signed, it moves over to the art purchase agreement. In that agreement, we have a section that states that our compliance committee have, if they do not approve of the artwork, they can cancel and withdraw from the agreement without liability to seller unless we have paid for the artwork. And we have made this clause in the agreement to make sure that our compliance committee have the final word in the process. And when the agreement, and this is also important to state because this clause has been useful in a couple of times, because sellers have been asking us to remove it from the agreement, and that indicates to us that they might not want to be fully transparent about the artwork. And in both of those cases, we have politely walked out of the deals. But when the agreement is signed, we also move into the protocol process where the investment committee has to fulfill a 16-item document where they state all of the necessary information about the artwork, the seller, the price, condition report, proof of authenticity, being either that the artwork is signed or that it has a certificate of authenticity.
Okay, Jonas, I'm going to come in there, and the reason I'm going to stop you is because what you're describing to my ear still sounds like significant hoops. If you are trying to, one, either be an artist and have your work sold, or if you're an organization that works in cultural activities, because not all organizations are going to have the kind of infrastructure that is required to meet terms like what you are discovering. Salman, I've kept you waiting really long. So thank you for being ever so patient and ever so tolerant with me. I hope you'll forgive me. So let me come to you. As someone who works and sits in a bank, there are two issues. One, how do you work with people like the ones that want to go to Jonas and have their work sold? How do you work with them to try to find that middle ground between a creative space and a structured space? And is the solution lying in tools such as tokenization, or maybe looking at hybrid ownership models so that you can have someone who has more structure sitting alongside someone who is less so?
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I will approach this from two angles. One is I want to propose two statements to this room. One, culture as an asset class has arrived. It is not in the process of arriving. On the global stage, culture as an asset class has arrived, and I'll explain to you why I feel that. The second thing I'll say, which I think is very relevant to a country like Saudi Arabia, which has a fantastic, youthful, aspirational population, is that culture is cool. It's a very cool thing. And it really binds communities, and it brings peoples together, and it makes them excited, and it makes them energized. So I think if you take these two hypotheses, from a financing and structuring perspective, this is becoming a very exciting area for us. Now, I don't look at culture purely as an art collection or a museum. I look at it as media. I look at it as creative industries. I look at it as gaming. I know that these are all areas where the kingdom has been extremely active. Yeah. So if you take a broad view of culture, then you look at adjacencies. If somebody wants to promote young artists, what are the adjacencies to that? Do you have art fairs? Do you have museums? Do you have commercial enterprises where, as His Excellency just said, where you have ways of exiting and valuing those works? So we look at those adjacencies. If you look purely in the form of financing, there is a stack. There is a very high-risk end, and you need to have institutions that address that. I think the Cultural Development Fund is doing a fantastic job of having created all of these different verticals, which can help everything from microloans to small businesses and to encourage them. In between, you have different kinds of blended finance initiatives, and then at the back end, you would have things that I'm very excited about, like, for example, impact bonds that are backed by assets, impact bonds that are backed by revenues. So if you have revenue-generating museums or you have revenue-generating enterprises, there are the cash flows that can support all of this. Clearly, public-private partnership is key to all of that. If you look at some of the most amazing public-private partnership projects in the world, I would just give you one example, the High Line in New York. I think most of us may have walked up and down the High Line. 8 million people there, 132 million was raised to make that happen. But most of the funding came from private sources and philanthropic donors. The city of New York continues to own the underlying asset. My last point on what you just mentioned around digitization and tokenization, I think that there is nothing more powerful than the sense of ownership. And again, I come back to Saudi Arabia. I have seen so many young, talented people come back to this country because they want to be a part of Vision 2030. There is nothing more powerful than them being able to say, I own a piece of that. So, for example, this is a beautiful building. Why could this building not be tokenized and that I could say, I own one seat in this building?
Yeah.
So there are many ways in which you can actually bring people in and embrace them into the process. It's about exploring those adjacencies and also making use of technology. So that's really where I'm coming from.
Saman, I'm sure your bank is very happy to have you there because you are talking all the right things and saying all the right things about how we can find more and interesting ways to make finance available, which is good for banking. But let's look at banking more broadly, and I'm not going to ask you to speak about your competitors. So I'm going to ask the CEO the question instead, so you can be comfortable for a moment. Are banks moving fast enough in terms of how they are thinking about and approaching the need to provide funding when it comes to cultural assets, broadly speaking?
Well, the culture and creative sector has a large market cap, which make it more lucrative for deployment. The establishment of CDF mirrors the historical trajectory of the industrial and the agriculture funds in the 1970s and the 1980s. The evidence of the cultural, let's say, demand and funding, it's already been very clear and visible today. So the household last year basically spending here in creativity, culture, and entertainment rose to 6%. So next moves is very clear, to push more culture capital by creating an institutional grade investment securities and vehicles, building regulatory framework to support cultural projects, and pushing more PPP projects to support the cultural projects.
Gosh, we've got 4 minutes left, so I'm going to try to do this as quickly as I can. Jonas, I want you to answer this question for me, if you will, quickly. The very nature of what you do and your business is innovative, because not many people are doing what it is that you do. But if we were to look beyond your business for just a moment, what is it that you see that is the most exciting innovation in this space for you as an organization? And I'd like you other gentlemen also to think about it. It's just that Jonas has a little bit less time to think about it, but please go ahead.
Yeah, this is going to be a very biased answer, but I would say Arte Collectum because I built it. But from an historical perspective, and this is important when it comes to innovations with art and finance, is that companies and organizations that tend to be less structured and more focused on the art, they have a tendency to run into trouble already in the medium term. The relationship between art and finance is fantastic, but it requires a balance, and it must have a mutual respect for each areas of expertise. Yeah. No one can live without the other.
Great. I thought you were going to tell me a little bit more. Thank you for that, Jonas. If I can come to you, Salman, if I can ask you maybe to also try to be as brief as possible. You alluded to it already in your answer, but if you're looking at exciting, innovative, different thinking that can push us in the right direction, what would that be?
Well, I think there's two things. One is just specifically on the topic of banks. I think banks have now started taking art lending as a very serious asset class. We, Deutsche Bank, certainly does. And I think that's probably also driven by the fact that we have a large corporate art collection, so we know a lot about the asset class. But even in terms of transparency, valuation, the scale and liquidity of the market, it's become much easier now to value art and therefore to allocate capital against it. So I think banks have a role to play. Banks are not private equity investors per se. But I think the other big innovation that I see more and more, which I love, is in the impact space, where you have public, private, and private investors in different categories. You've got risk-taking investors and you've got philanthropic investors. And you can put all of that together into a program where you say, we're going to start a program, there's a group of people who will invest in this program, they will get a return for investing in the program. But as the outcomes are achieved, a new group of investors will come in and take out the first group. And then eventually, as His Excellency alluded, you have vehicles that can lend themselves to public ownership. So I think this coming together of different asset classes of investors is a very exciting development, and I think a lot more work should be done in that
And I suppose
space.
being open to that is precisely what you described. Majid, I'm going to ask you to really give me a quick answer.
I second what Salman mentioned, and I would add a blended, I would say, financing products, debt plus grants or equity plus grants, I think is very needed, I would say, going forward. Innovative financing products such as IP-backed financing should be pushed to support entrepreneurs. We at CDF focusing on diversifying and preparing our pipeline so culture becomes a credible and stable asset class.
Okay. Work with me, gentlemen. Work with me. Really quick answer. I'm going to ask you a question. I need the fastest answer in 3 words or less.
Yes.
Now, I'm going to start with you, Saman. One thing that we need to do when we leave here in terms of how we can better support the change that we're seeing when it comes to funding in this space. Quick answer. Go.
Work together.
Oh, 2 words. That's great. Jonas?
Invest in art funds.
Okay, that was 3. Very good. Invest in art funds, work together. And you, Majid?
I would say work closely with investors and commercial banks.
Okay, so if we work together, invest in art funds, and work more closely together, even though that's quite similar to what Saman said, but it's okay. If we do those things, hopefully we can see some innovative, different thinking that emerges around how we can better fund cultural spaces and initiatives in the world, and seeing increased GDP contribution going forward. Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure. It's been so much fun.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Please give them a round of applause and show your appreciation.